All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's discussion about AI and democracy. For those who might be joining us for the first time, or for those who just want to hear the spiel again, Network 2020 is a New York City-based nonprofit, and we provide a platform for nuanced and nonpartisan discussions about global affairs. We're really trying to just inject more information into a highly saturated information environment, but one that is a little bit deeper than wide. So just as a little background about this event, we had originally conceived of this event during the spate of elections in 2024 to explore the idea that AI-generated images could pose a threat to elections. However, the discussion, and one that we really couldn't have had a couple of years ago because the environment has changed so much, really is a critical one regardless of the passing of a major election year, because of the rapid growth of AI and the fragmented nature of regulation, which often reflects divergent political realities around the world. And of course, I think everyone is really tracking the release of China's AI model Deepseek, which is further complicating this rapidly changing domain. So I think there's a lot to talk about today, and I hope we can cover a lot of it. We have two excellent speakers, so it's my great pleasure to introduce them today. So first, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Joshua Tucker. Josh is the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia and co-director of the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU, among other roles. He is also currently a contributor to Brookings's Economics of AI series. And as you can see, his bio is much more extensive than that, but we're very pleased to welcome him today. And it's also my great pleasure to welcome back to Network 2020 Yael Eisenstat. She brings a wealth of experience in the public and private sectors, including in security, information, and advocacy. She is a senior fellow at Cybersecurity for Democracy and former head of global elections integrity at Facebook, and has spent over 2 decades combating extremism, polarization, and anti-democratic behavior, both on and offline. So welcome to you both. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation. And thank you, everyone who is joining us today. So Yael, I'd love to start with you, and with a big question, which is, our scene setter question. Could you just help us by framing the relationship between AI and democracy and why it matters in today's political landscape?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me back. I've enjoyed, as we were talking before, our in-person sessions in the pre-pandemic days, and would love to hopefully be in rooms with all of you again. So AI in and of itself is a very large term, and I mean, a lecture on all the ways that AI is used and affects the things we care about would take the full hour. So I'm going to focus on, for this conversation, when we're talking about whether it's AI-powered algorithms that are used for things like content moderation, or how AI is used in our current information landscape. And then there's generative AI, right, which is things like synthetic video, synthetic audio, ChatGPT. It's when the AI itself is generating content. And those are sort of two sides of the coin of what we're talking about here when it comes to democracy and elections. So as mentioned, obviously, AI can be and is increasingly used in things like content moderation, trying to enforce the rules that any given platform has stated are their rules. For example, if your platform has decided that nudity is not allowed on the platform, where can AI play in trying to unburden some of the load on human moderators and catch nude imagery on its own? So there's the content moderation side. There's also, which we may or may not get into as much, how AI or algorithms play into things like ranking of content, amplification of content, what the platforms are recommending, how different content or ads are targeted to us. All of these things have profound impacts on things like how we engage with information around political topics, how political discourse occurs, how we protect election integrity online. What is interesting is obviously in the last few years, we've also seen more sophisticated AI being used in the other part of what I mentioned, which is more on the generative AI side. And I'm sure we'll get into this in the conversation, but before the election, there was a lot of conversation of like, is this going to be the AI election? Is this going to be the election where a deep fake or a fake audio clip is going to somehow sway the election? And I think it's really important to understand that it's not even so much about whether the technology itself is so sophisticated that we were going to have this onslaught of fake videos that were going to convince us one way or the other about the election. I think one of the things we really need to grapple with is the mere awareness that these tools exist is causing even more distrust in what people see. And while a healthy skepticism is incredibly important, not trusting any sources online anymore can really set up a situation that can also be very dangerous. We've all heard the prisoner's dilemma, right? Where an actor uses, for example, I'll give an example that does not have to do with our current political landscape, but someone gets caught in a video doing something. Let's say a politician in any country, a video comes out of them inappropriately touching someone. All they have to say now is, that wasn't me, that's fake. And yes, there will be people who can technically eventually prove whether or not that video is real, but that doesn't matter. They've already put that out into the world, and people have become so primed to believe the things that confirm their biases already, that this is where I think the proliferation of things like more sophisticated generative AI tools really plays into the conversation we're having. Not just whether they're convincing enough to sway an election, but how they are impacting how we even engage with information to begin with. I'll pause there because there's so much to this question, but I'll pause there.
I feel like the first question is always the hardest because there's just so much ground to cover. So you did great. Thank you. Josh, turning to you, you're the co-center or the co-director of NYU's Center for Social Media and Politics. And so I'd like to just kind of step out. Yael touched on that relationship between AI and social media. But I'd love to hear from you about your take on the interplay between the two. And especially, it seems interesting to me that there's been such a pendulum shift when it comes to social media, which in the very beginning was seen as this great democratizing force. And now I think it's really being understood as a driver of political polarization. How do you see AI fitting into this as it rapidly develops? And in particular, the kind of that conversation between policymakers and the tech world.
Right. Thanks, Courtney. Thanks for having me here today. Yeah, and again, this is a huge question. There's lots and lots of ways to dig into this. Let me start with your question about the pendulum, and we'll talk just a little bit about social media, and then I'll wrap at the end by sort of leading back into social media and AI and a way to think about the link between those two. I think, when we look back on the history of social media and its relationship to democracy and the way that people thought about it, pendulum is a great way to describe that. And I really think the shift had to do with real world global events that took place, not fundamental changes in the technology itself, or even fundamental actions on the part of the platforms themselves. When we first sort of saw social media burst into the political scene, it was around the Arab Spring. It was around other events. There were things coming out of Eastern Central Europe, the former Soviet Union, called colored revolutions. And we began to all of a sudden see social media being used as a tool of pro-democracy activists. And so if you go back, in fact, if you look at like Larry Diamond at Stanford, coined this term liberation technology. It became the name of a book. Social media was going to bring democracy to the rest of the world because it was finally a sort of information medium that autocrats couldn't control, right? And it like the next step after the fax machine, right? And then when does the pendulum begin to swing? The pendulum begins to swing in 2015 and 2016 when the world wakes up to two election outcomes, one first in Britain around Brexit, the second in the United States, that were quite unexpected for lots of people. And all of a sudden, there's sort of growing attention to social media, and in particular for its ability to serve as a transmission of news. And it serves as a transmission of news and information in a way that becomes apparent to people at this point, that the same way that gatekeepers get removed in authoritarian countries around protest, gatekeepers are getting removed in the production and dissemination of news. And so all of a sudden, what used to be the purview of editors, of producers of television news, anyone now could share news. And in 2015 and 2016, we got exposed to this term at the time, which was this term fake news, which, you know, I'm old enough to remember when fake news actually meant news that was produced by by websites that were faking the fact that they were journalists and they were actually just trying to get clicks to make money. And so we actually wrote this. We wrote this article in the Journal of Democracy, actually, because, you know, Larry Diamond's This Liberation Turmoil had appeared in 2011, and then in 2017, after the 2006 U.S. elections, my co-author Nate Persley had an article called "Can Democracy Survive the Internet?" And we tried to get at this question of, was social media liberation technology, or was it can democracy survive the internet? And the argument that we made in that piece is that social media itself is neither inherently good nor bad for democracy, but it's a tool that political actors can use. And we argued that two aspects of social media could help explain how it could be both liberation technology and can democracy survive the internet. And this is that social media, totally, one cannot deny this, it democratizes access to information, right? It removes barriers to information, and it gives people access to media who do not have access to mainstream media, right? So this is a fundamental change. People without access to mainstream media can spread information. But on the other hand, it's also a tool that can be used to silence voices, right? And this is a tool that can be used to try to control who speaks, right? Both of these things can happen. And if you go through the different contexts, if you think about in authoritarian regimes, who doesn't have access to mainstream media? Well, that includes pro-democracy activists. It also includes a lot of other people, but it includes pro-democracy activists. And so the ability to coordinate with one another, the ability to share information, to learn from each other, these are things that can help enhance democracy activists in authoritarian regimes. But of course, then authoritarian regimes eventually kind of wake up to this threat, and they develop their own all sorts of tools to try to control the conversation online. And this ranges from offline tools of arresting people, physical violence against people who are online, to all sorts of online tools, such as traditional censorship. Like we think about, blocking keywords in China, as well as a sort of new internet era style attempt to control the conversation online, which is to inject content, right? This is different from, for older forms of censorship. And here we think about sort of Russian bots and trolls. And if you roll this forward then into democracies like we had, like into the 2016 US elections and into other open societies, well, if you think about who didn't have access to mainstream media, well, on the one hand, if you want to take a kind of Chomsky type look at the thing, and think of traditional media as being an arm of the capitalist class and working to advance the capitalist class interests, you look at things like progressive voices are able to get more access. You get things like Black Lives Matter. You get things like Occupy Wall Street appearing on the internet. On the same time, if you want to think about who else was not getting access to mainstream media in the United States back in the Walter Cronkite days and TV news, it was people who were sort of anti-systemic and fundamentally opposed to democracy and wanting to change the system. So social media sort of as a tool, it can simultaneously empower both of those groups. And then ironically, what you can also see happening is that groups that are actually small portions of the population are able to use the tools that in some ways were developed by these autocratic regimes to deal with their online opposition to really amplify their message. So end of the day, as we roll into the AI era, I think that's a kind of background way of thinking about social media and democracy. And I want to just close close by this answer to this first question by just noting, the question of whether or not you sort of said in your question, and now we think social media increases political polarization. That's actually an empirical question. The question whether it's good or bad for democracy, I think, is an amorphous question that we have to think about holistically. But these very specific things, these are things we can empirically test. And this is what a lot of researchers in this area are trying to do, especially as the technologies evolve, to try to get a sense of what is the relationship between these platforms and some of these negative outcomes that we are worried about. And I think going back to Yael's point about the difference between with AI of the first order problem of does AI make people believe things that aren't true? and the second order problem of what happens in a world where everyone thinks AI is ubiquitous. It's the same question to ask about all of these other nefarious things. Like, what is the first order problem of the nefarious thing that may be happening? What's the second order concern about people believing it's happening more than it might be happening?
Thanks. And this is your question about, or your point about testing, I think is a great segue into this next question for you, Yael, which is about the Meta recently changing their fact-checking policies in the name of free speech and aligning more closely with X's policies, which have also reduced access to data for researchers. So what are these changes having, what impact are these changes having on efforts to combat disinformation?
Yeah, I have a lot to say on this topic. I think one of the things that has been really interesting around how a lot of the media has spoken or written about these changes at Meta is it does benefit someone like Mark Zuckerberg to have us focus the conversation about fact checking and whether or not fact checking is good or bad, whether or not fact checking is censoring speech, which it is not. And I'm happy to explain the answer there. Because then we're not actually talking about some of the deeper systemic issues of whether or not these platforms themselves are designed in a way that might be contributing to more extreme content, or to, as Josh said, there's a lot of research out there of whether or not the design and the platforms themselves are contributing to further polarization, all those questions, because they got us focused on this question about fact checking. But that was only one of several things that happened during that same 24 to 48 hour period. So yes, Mark Zuckerberg stood up, and let's be very clear, it was a 100% political move. This is not surprising. He is not, in previous years, he was a little more discreet about political choices that were being made at the company. This time there's not even, the mask is off. It was Donald Trump had threatened Mark Zuckerberg over the years with whether it was him threatening to jail him, or whether it's threatening to take away their preemptive immunity, or all these different threats over the years. And because he doesn't like being fact checked on the platform. That's just, like, if I were to boil it down to the most simplistic statement, it's obviously more complicated than that. But fact checking in and of itself, let's be very clear, is a small part of what happens on these platforms, right? Like, fact checking is not the same thing as censoring speech. Fact checking, in fact, doesn't even cover the vast majority of what flows through these companies, but it is trying to put in some, working with actual organizations that have certain standards that go to look at certain content, and then maybe append a label of whether or not this meets certain fact-checking criteria. So to me, that was a little bit of throwing red meat to people who were pressuring them to stop doing that. The other things that he did at the same time, though, was to roll back a bunch of the hate speech policies, to change that to hateful conduct instead of hate speech, to, like, it's not even subtle. It was, let's take away all of our rules around transgendered and a lot of our LGBTQ plus rules. Let's remove some of our rules around hate speech in general. And we can all debate whether or not we want to be on platforms where hate speech is allowed. I'm very sad to say hate speech is not illegal. So, like, if a platform decides we want to allow hate speech, that's their right. I might not love it, but that's their right. My question is, what is the platform itself doing with that hate speech? Is the platform's own algorithms amplifying it because their algorithms have understood that that is what is going to get more engagement? Are they recommending it to people? Those are the things that we're not talking about because we're so focused on the fact-checking piece. I wrote a piece in the Bulwark about Mark Zuckerberg's announcements, and I really broke it into 3 key things, since that's really the question here. First, again, and I'm happy to put it in the chat if I can find it afterwards, focusing on fact-checking is convenient to these platforms, because then we're not focusing on some of the bigger systemic issues of how these platforms are designed and what those consequences are. Second, coupled with their changes in hate speech policies, I do believe this is going to lead to actually a further proliferation of whether it's disinformation, extremism, hate speech. I'm not saying that we have seen that categorically yet, but just looking at what happened on X, when X decided that they were going to roll back a bunch of those policies, although on X it was different, they also re-platformed like many accounts that had been the most brazenly violative accounts to begin with. And they put their fingers on the scale by saying, if you pay $8 a month, we will amplify your content in the For You feed. And we documented, when I was at ADL, we documented the percentage rise that that created in hate speech and whatnot. So I do think it'll be, if it goes in that direction, we will see a proliferation of more extreme content. But third, especially since this is Network 2020 and foreign policy is a big part of the interest of this audience, I actually found the most important part of Mark Zuckerberg's video announcement that day was that he brazenly said that he's going to partner with this administration, with Donald Trump, to pressure countries around the world to not regulate him. And what's so interesting there is that's pretty brazen. Like, that used to be, these kinds of quid pro quos used to sort of happen in smoky, dark back rooms. You didn't publicly announce that I'm giving this to the president, and in return, he is going to go after the Europeans and the Australians and others for daring to try to regulate us. And that goes into like sovereignties of other countries who have the right to have their own laws and enforce them. So I think there's broader implications here, well beyond just what that means here at home. I'll find my article and throw it into the chat because I go into much more detail of the implications there.
Great, thank you. And I think Brian might be able to do that as well. And Josh, could I just follow up with you on the piece about the data? Because I know you're doing a lot of data-driven research, and I'd just be curious if you wanted to add a little color to that and how that might be impacting your own work.
About data access and changes
Yes.
in data access. So,
yes.
yeah, I mean, this is a key component. If we go back, if we go back to these questions about when we're talking about here about whether these individual aspects of these platforms are having the impacts that we think we're having the impacts on, right? It's difficult to try to answer those questions, right? And at the end of the day, those questions, there's lots of different ways we can try to get at. And as academics, we take advantage of all sorts of different tools when we're doing this. And there's some stuff we can do on our own without the cooperation of the platforms. We can run experiments. We can, there's been really cool advances in what are called browser extensions, where you can basically have someone who's interacting with a social media platform, but you can put a browser extension on Chrome and sort of change what their experience is like to try to test theories that you have about something like, oh, what the algorithm is doing. What if we change the way the algorithm is doing? And there are even scholars who are building their own sort of bespoke platforms, so you can have different types of rules on platforms and see what happens in them. All of these things, of course, have kind of trade-offs. But at the end of the day, if we want policymakers to know what's actually happening on these particular platforms, it requires access to the data itself on those platforms, right? And B, if we really want to get into sort of causal impacts, the best way that you can get at causal impacts is to be able to run experiments to actually change the thing that you're interested in with consenting participants, with people who are involved, people who are willing to take part in these studies. But this, again, requires access to the platforms to try to run these types of experiments. And so the question for the public is, what level of accountability, what level of transparency does the public want to require of these platforms, right? So Nate and I wrote this book called Social Media and Democracy, which was a sort of literature review of what we had learned about lots of these topics like polarization, like misinformation, like hate speech. And in the end, in the following chapter, we sort of talked about these challenges, and we're like, look, if you want to understand what's happening on the platforms, you basically have three options. Besides, one is like just go home because the other things are too hard, right? Option number one is work without the platforms. That has pros and cons. Option number two is try to work collaboratively with the platforms. That has pros and cons. And option number three is try to work with governments to get governments to regulate that the platforms make this kind of information available to outside researchers. So I think we are at a really kind of important inflection point here, because the bottom line on 1 and 2, as long as you are working with platform data, whether you're working outside of any cooperation with the platforms and collecting the data yourself, or you're working with the platforms, researchers are ultimately going to be at the mercy of the platforms for that research to take place, right? We had this, I was lead on this, put together this great team to do this report for the Hewlett Foundation all the way back in 2017. And we were talking about kind of the state of the field. And we had two big recommendations. We were like, one, everybody is talking about Twitter. And the reason was it was really easy to study Twitter. We could get access to Twitter data fairly easily then. And we were like, really? But the information ecosystem, we said that back in 2017, is getting much bigger than Twitter. We really need to start figuring out what's going on with these platforms. Well, be careful what you ask for. Right now, it's become much, much harder to study Twitter. And I'm not talking about collaborative efforts with Twitter. It's just Twitter has made it much, much more difficult for people to get access to the data on those platforms. So we're at this kind of inflection moment where we're having an explosion of different social media platforms that we want to know more about. TikTok, Truth Social, we're in a world where there's just more platforms out there than there was previously. But in some ways, it's become harder to get access to data that we were able to get access to. At the same time, there's this moment where the European Union, as part of the Digital Services Act and Article 40 in particular, has codified that platforms need to make data available to external researchers. Now, it hasn't codified that they need to take the next step of allowing us to sort of observe experimentation to try to get at causal impacts of these platforms. But in the meantime, so these things are kind of happening both simultaneously. So it is a really important question to see what's going to happen in the future. And we really do think that policymakers should think seriously about this, because whether you have left-wing or right-wing preferences, right, we would hope that everybody kind of wants their policies to be informed by what's actually happening, and that worlds where only people who work for the platforms know what's happening on the platforms is not ideal for policymaking, regardless of your political persuasion.
Can I add a point to that, Courtney? Because this is,
sure.
I could not agree more strongly. And this is also one of the things we've been working on for a long time, both when I was at ADL and now at Cyber for Democracy. It's not about transparency just for transparency's sake. Like, some people are like, transparency, that sounds great, but so what? It is, to Josh's point, in order to actually craft smart, enforceable policies, you have to understand both how the current systems work and what is actually achievable and enforceable. And I know this is going to be sounding like I'm putting it in the most blatant, obvious terms, but sometimes I try to get out of the academic way of explaining things and just say, listen, imagine if any other industry, this isn't an industry that's still like this childish new industry that we like to talk about, right? This is, the tech industry is probably the most powerful, rich industry at this point. Imagine any other industry that could get away with saying, only we get to study ourselves. And when we put those studies out, you have to trust that we are being accurate. Imagine if the pharmaceutical industry not only got to study itself, but then if someone got sick off of medicines, they got to actually study why they got sick, create their own answers to that, and then decide themselves how they're going to fix it. That is where we are with especially with social media platforms right now. I mean, the whole next wave of AI is a whole nother question. And the very basic idea, so just to expand when Josh said why it's so much harder now on X, this was intentional. We used to be able to study. Twitter was never fantastic at enforcing its own rules. And by the way, we never study. My work has never been, you should take this down, you should leave this up. It's always been about testing whether they enforce their own rules, whether they claim that they have a rule that the public should know about if you want to use this platform, and then whether or not they enforce those rules. And when Musk bought the platform, he charges, what is it now, Josh? $40-something thousand for data. It is completely cost prohibitive for most nonprofits and academics. And then on Meta, they killed their tool called Crowd Tangle, which so many people were using to be able to study the platform. And so now we have to shift more and more to experimental ways to study these platforms, to use more anecdotal evidence, to try to create personas and document how the algorithms, where they take us. But it is the only industry that studies itself. And that, like the idea that basic transparency regulation is this complicated in the US should concern all of us for how much influence this industry is having, including on lawmaking.
Yeah, if I could just add one more thing before we move on to another topic, right? Like, I mean, if you think about the analogies here, like we have situations where it is perfectly acceptable that banks have regulators embedded in the banks who do stress testing on the banks, right? So there is precedent for this. This isn't a completely kind of new idea here. So I just wanted to echo Yael's point that like that, that sealing off this industry as it really would be sealing it off as different from other industries. And a lot of interesting thoughts going on in this regard. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. And I realize I will need to switch to the Q&A box, excuse me, fairly soon, but I want to get in a couple more questions. So if you are listening and you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box. Josh, I'll go to you now, and I'd love to just get your take on sort of how you're assessing the world's current progress in addressing AI-driven threats to democracy. Are we on the right track? What is being done?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tough question, right? Because we don't even know quite what the AI threats to democracy are. And so saying what's being done to address them, is it sufficient or not sufficient? Following on our previous conversation, which I will keep very short on, right? Again, transparency is super, super important. Like we've tried to reach out to some of these companies, we've tried to reach out to people in the government about trying to, from the get-go, build in mechanisms whereby there can be transparency and people can understand what's happening on those platforms. There's a very interesting thing in the chatbot world, which is that of these large language models, none of them are open source. We don't know like what training data is being used, how they're being trained up. But some of the models are what's known as open weight, where the outputs of the models are made public so people can actually stress test them and do that themselves, which is, which it has its own pros and cons, because it also means anyone can spin up their own models without safeguards that the companies may have put on them themselves. So I don't even want to weigh into that. But like, there's the transparency question on this. I think as we look back on 2024, I really want to echo what Yael said. And we had written about this beforehand in the Brookings column, but the same kind of framework of like first order concerns and second order concerns. I think when we look back on 2024, this is going to have been really, really apparent. There were all these pieces written before the 2024 election about how AI could be used in the context of elections and how it might be dangerous. And one useful way for people in the audience to think about this, that I've kind of thought about it from a political economy framework, is to think about, social media lowered the cost of the distribution of content, right? But you still had to produce content. And generative AI has the ability to lower the cost of the production of content. So going into the election system, we tried to think about, okay, who benefits from lowering the production of content? And on the one hand, you can think about really nefarious uses of this, right? Anyone who wants to run a foreign influence campaign in a country where they don't have the language skills, that suddenly got a lot easier, right? Like if you go back to 2016, how some of this stuff was picked up on was, people doing foreign influence campaigns pretending to be Americans that didn't really sound like they were Americans. Those kinds of things have just gotten much easier. And especially if you think about, well, lots of people know English, but if you think about languages that are not known by as many people, such as Dutch or Slovak or, Tagali, then this is a way that you can get into concern where you have concerns about this. But we can also think about really positive things that might be able to happen in this regard too, right? Like who else doesn't have the resources, right, can benefit from lowering the cost of production? Well, imagine you have a district where people speak lots of different languages and you're a local candidate running for office. Previously, maybe you could afford English, you could afford Spanish, but maybe you couldn't afford outreach in all of these languages. That's just become easier too. So maybe this is going to be something that drives down the cost of campaigning. And in general, we think when the cost of campaigning is driven down, that actually can help challengers and help sort of cut into incumbency disadvantages, which people tend to think can be, you know, a positive for democracy. When we look back on 2024, the year of the election, I think we can absolutely see there are instances we can pick and choose from where we find where people are a little worried about what did happen with generative AI. I think there were some bad instances of female candidates getting attacked using generative AI. I think in terms of the consequentialness of it, the sort of most consequential thing that I've heard about or potentially consequential involved the Slovak parliamentary elections early on in the year and an audio recording, which is actually kind of interesting, with audio maybe being a sweet spot between where people are used to knowing that text may or may not be created by humans and the video isn't quite that good. But we also saw really creative use of generative AI, right? We saw in Pakistan when a candidate who was imprisoned using generative AI as a way to reach out to candidates. We saw interesting things about voter outreach around it. And I think at the end of the day, we will look back on this as the dog that didn't, you know, the dog that didn't bite, right? The dog that barked that we were talking about so much beforehand. And that these first order concerns, right, that elections were going to be swayed by things that were false that people would believe. I mean, if you look at the United States election, by far the most consequential video image in that election was absolutely real. And it was President Biden in that first debate. There was nothing faked about that, but it had an enormous amount of impact on the way the rest of the election campaign came about. But that absolutely raises the question that Yael has pointed out, which is this issue of what are these second order effects? What is the impact of living in a world where people believe generative AI is ubiquitous? And how hard does it become to convince people, not our first order concern that people believe false things to be true, but how hard does it become to convince people that true things are actually true? And because that gets at the issue of accountability in democracy. And we did see, again, I don't think it was as bad as I was worried, looking at some of the numbers of people who thought genAI were ubiquitous, worried about it in the context of elections. But we saw this a little bit in the election when Donald Trump didn't like the fact that Kamala Harris was getting big crowds at her rallies. The claim was they were AI generated, right? There was this in North Carolina, the Republican candidate made a claim about something being AI generated that looked, you know, bad for him and stuff like that. So I think this is going to be the really interesting question going forward, because these technologies are going to get better, right? So it may be that these first order concerns, just 2024 was a little too early for them to be serious. But it may also be that, you know, people were well aware, there was lots of people, you know, out there trying to look at this, that these first order concerns will be less of a problem that we think they're going to be. But as the technology gets better and better, the second order concerns, I think, continue to be a huge question for all of us going forward, and something I think that we don't want to take our eye off the ball, because, and I think when we do testing of how human beings interact with AI, it's really important to also understand how this is impacting their relationship to trust and information generally.
Great point. Thank you. Yael, turning to you, we talked a little bit earlier about some of the different regulatory environments around the world. We kind of alluded to that. And you've worked in both the government and the private sector, I think, at really interesting levels. How, in your opinion, can policymakers balance innovation with the need for oversight, given this current geopolitical environment, both writ large and then also in terms of approaches to AI and whatnot?
Yeah. I think there's this false dichotomy between the idea that you can either have an innovation or you can have regulation. And it very much benefits the tech industry for people to continue to believe in that false dichotomy. You know, it's interesting, a lot of times when you're talking about different ways to put in potential guardrails, you get this, but we do more good than harm. I want to just start with unpacking that. It doesn't matter if you do more good than harm. The government's job is to protect against the harm. Like, it is not, it doesn't, this is this false like thing that, by the way, also these companies have never actually quantified, which is hilarious considering how much they believe in like data and quantifying things. This, we do more good or we do more harm. I can give you 500 great examples of the ways AI can be used in positive ways in the future. while also saying, and what are the guardrails we should put in place to protect against potentially bad uses, whether it's uses by bad actors, which seems to be easier because that's putting the responsibility on individuals, or on the companies themselves. And I'm not going to get into my whole platform here about where I think all the different potential laws would be good or bad or could change, but I just think it's at a high level important to understand that, because so much of the conversation gets into, but it does good too. Yes, it does. Every industry does both good and harm. And the government's role is to figure out the externalities and how to protect against that. So that was very obscure. I get it. Some of the things, again, we've already talked a lot about transparency, so I won't rehash that one, but that is a major part of this. What can a regulatory framework look like? There's also power structures, which we didn't really get into a lot here, but when I left Facebook in 2018, I didn't really start speaking out until 2019, but journalists would often ask me this question that was unprovable. They would often ask me, did Mark Zuckerberg put his finger on the scale of the election in 2016? Or, they wanted me to somehow prove that Facebook somehow intentionally swayed an election one way or the other. And I would constantly answer, and I will give that same answer today. That is the wrong question. First of all, I don't know if we're going to be able to prove whether a platform, like there's so many elements there, you would have to prove there's causality, that's almost unprovable. But the fact that we have allowed any one individual or one platform to accumulate the power and potential to possibly put their finger on the scales of an election is the thing we should be concerned about. And that's the core of my answer. There right now is this unchecked power to design your platforms however you want, to allow, there are some little things that have succeeded. Like it took quite a long time to get to the point where we said, wait a minute, you can't target housing ads to only white people because that actually violates laws against discrimination. That was not a case that was won overnight, right? Like that, even just proving that, yes, your own tools are contributing to things that are illegal or harmful in the real world is the hardest part for us to get to. I am not going to give my Section 230 speech here because I'll put everybody to sleep. And again, it's not even that I think we should get rid of Section 230. Never have. I think it's a very important law. But we need to figure out, what are companies responsible for and what are they not? And that is something we have not grappled with. Do I think a social media company is responsible for spewing racist stuff on their platform? No, that person's responsible for what they're saying. Do I think we need to figure out if a company should be responsible for if they recommended a predator and a child and connected them together and gave them the tools to, there's so many levels that fall. I saw somebody in the chat, it might have been Charles here. I couldn't agree more. These companies hide very much behind this notion of free speech. It's all about free speech. We're just these neutral pipes, and we do not want to be responsible for being the arbiters of truth. But all the other things, how their targeting tools work, how they recommend stuff, whether or not they're connecting illegal activity, those things are being often overly broadly interpreted as falling under the idea of free speech. And it's going to take a lot of work, both in educating the courts who see some of these cases and in helping lawmakers grapple with what is platform behavior versus what is just pure speech. And I know I didn't give the full answer there because that would have taken me another 35 minutes, but that's what I grapple with.
Fair enough. And I think we have something of you talking about Section 230 from a few years ago. So those who are willing to dig into our archives.
My thoughts are probably evolved more sophisticated since then, but yes.
Excellent. We have a couple questions here, Josh, turning to you about algorithms in social media. So one questioner asks about what role does algorithmic transparency play in restoring trust in social media platforms? And so I think we can use that to talk about AI. And also, as we move from ranking algorithms in current social media platforms to AI agents, I guess machine to machine, how will disinformation proliferate?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now there are, we're living in a time of massive change. Although we always seem to be saying this when we were studying the digital information environment, which makes it more challenging to wrap our hands around what's actually happening, and goes back to all the importance of transparency before. But there are three big things that are happening right now. One is the proliferation of platforms from a political standpoint, from people who are interested in politics. Proliferation of platforms compared to where we were, even 4 years ago, certainly 8 years ago. The second thing is what I've been calling the TikTokification of social media feed delivery, right? The magic of TikTok was that they got away from what is called the social graph as the determinant of your feed. And the social graph means that the content you see when you log onto these platforms is content that's posted by people you chose to follow. And Facebook, that could be pages or groups, and friends, and X, it's who you choose to follow. On LinkedIn, it's who you're connected to or who you follow. It just, that's where all the content came from. Now, to be super clear as to what Yael was talking about, as soon as they went away from reverse chronological, which was the simplest measure by which you just saw the most recent thing from someone you followed, algorithms were already at play. So there's an inventory of content you could see, but that inventory used to be limited to people you had chosen to make a relationship with. And then within that inventory, the algorithm decided what to see you. And we know all sorts of things about how those algorithms are optimized. But basically, at the end of the day, it was about making you like the platform more and staying on the platform more. But now when TikTok came along, there was a way on TikTok to be able to get this kind of social graph feed. But what everybody used on TikTok was this For You feed. And what that does was it changed the potential inventory you could have seen from people you had chosen to follow to anything the platform thought you would like. And TikTok became really, really good at figuring out what you would like. And so this is people call this the individualized algorithm. And because it was so successful, you see other platforms picking up on it. We're now on Facebook, on Instagram, on X. Unless you take a lot of steps to make this not happen, you're going to see content from the platform that the platform thinks you would like. So that's the second big change. And of course, the third big change is that we now have generative AI as a way of being able to produce content here. So I think all of these things mean that the answers to these questions that we're asking, we have to begin to ask them anew, and we have to try to figure out systematically how these different changes are impacting us. And in order to be able to do that, we have to be able to try to study these things. So I think when we look, by the way, on the subject of AI, just to add one more thing on this, I think when we think about AI and democracy particularly, I would like to argue, or AI in politics, I'd like to argue there's sort of two different types of questions we want to be asking here. One question that we want to learn is how humans interact with AI. And that gets back to the questioner's point about trust, right? The simple answer to, will algorithmic transparency increase trust in platforms, is, I guess it would, but I don't know, right? It might be that what really increases trust with platforms is when you go on a platform and platforms show you the kind of content you want to see. And at that point, you trust the platform because it seems to know you well. It's giving you what you want. It gives you a warm feeling. It might be, I'd like to think that algorithmic transparency will make people's trust, but these are studies we would have to run to figure this out. And Yael might be aware of some studies. I'm not actually aware of studies that specifically test that question. I do think if you're a policymaker, though, and you want to know what's happening on a platform, algorithmic transparency puts you in a much better place to make your regulatory decisions, whether they're in a laissez-faire direction or whether they're in a more activist direction. You want to know about what's happening on this particular platform. But I think as scholars and as researchers, we want to know, like, with AI, how do humans interact with it? So these kinds of questions about trust, what does it do to trust? When do people tend to believe things? When do they not tend to believe things? But the other question we want to know is, these large language models, do they have political biases built into them? So we do live in a situation now where there's been a tremendous amount of attention to what I would call ascriptive biases that Yael was talking about, right? If you train data in a if you train these models on a particular set of data, that you train it on all sorts of mortgage-based data that was biased towards people who are not white and assign them higher interest rates, AI is trained on that, will learn to do those kinds of things. But there are politically relevant questions out there as well about what kind of training data is going into these models and what impact it has. And these have gotten a lot less attention. And I think this is a really important question. And ultimately, it's going to be an important question for how these models are trusted. And we saw this in the last few days with the sudden rise of Deepseek, all the attention that Deepseek got around around the model. But then as a side note of that, people started talking about, well, the model wouldn't answer questions about Chinese politics, potentially sensitive questions about Chinese politics. That's brought this to the forefront. But in a sense, that's actually the simple answer. That's the simple question to be asking. The simple question is, are Chinese models going to be less deferential to Chinese, more deferential to Chinese political concerns? Right? The answer to that shouldn't really surprise anybody. But there's a much deeper question here, which is, based on the way these models are trained, are they going to have political biases even in the models from the Western countries, even in the models that we're looking to that everyone is using right now, where we don't think those things are there, but because of the fact, for example, that Chinese propaganda is out there on the internet, gets into training data, right? At the same time that you have US news sources that are trying to close their materials off to these platforms for very legitimate reasons, right, around copyright and around protections of authors. But what are going to be the implications of those too? So I think there are these like multiple levels of questions that in particular the rise of Deepseek recently has raised.
Can I have one sentence very short to the end of that?
Go
If
for it.
we've learned anything from the past decade of social media, like I know a lot of people just want to move on, like stop talking about Facebook. We got to worry about like OpenAI now. If we've learned anything from the past decade, it's that everything that Josh just mentioned are not things that the companies themselves, just out of their own goodwill, are going to seek to fix. And I think that's the challenge. There are still many people who believe that the companies, if just enough pressure, that the companies will do the right thing because it's the right thing for all of us. That is fundamentally untrue. And so just everything Josh just mentioned, they're not going to be compelled to ensure that they are not baking in political biases or any of the challenges. We could list 50 more that we didn't even talk about today without actual consequences and incentive structures, both economic and regulatory, to compel them to do so.
Thank you. Question for you, Yael. We have someone here who writes that the current platforms that sway opinion are electronic, but prior to that, television networks and newspaper syndicates were able to easily favor a person running for office. Back then, the updates to the content weren't real time. TV had its news slots. But how does that differ from what we're seeing today?
Sure. Absolutely. Like, this is the funny thing. When you work on issues of social media, people misinterpret that to mean that I think that social media is the only problem. So, not at all, but different to the point of this question. You know, obviously, especially I would say with the rise of the 24-hour cable news network systems, it was just started becoming this never-ending have to fill time, have to fill 24 hours. Things started becoming more ideological and all of these things. I think one of the differences, not to say that one is more dangerous, it's different. One of the differences is when you turn on MSNBC or you turn on Fox News, you know why you are going to that channel. You are going to that channel because it fits some form. Usually, I'm not speaking for every human, obviously, but often you are going to that channel because it fits some sort of worldview of yours. And even though it can take you further and further down a path that is in no way balanced or fair, anybody who's turning on Fox News is watching the same thing at that point. Anyone who turns on MSNBC is both watching the same thing and know what they're getting into for. When you go on to Facebook, and I know people think nobody uses Facebook anymore. I hate to tell you that's just not true. Like, there's an entire world out there that still uses Facebook, but I'm just going to use Facebook in this example. Often you are not going onto Facebook because you are expecting that you are going to be targeted in a certain way. Maybe you're going on to look at what your friends are doing. Maybe you want to look at cat videos. Maybe you do want to hear what the latest political scuttlebutt is. But you, first of all, are in no way having the same experience as anybody else on that platform. And so I'll give just a concrete example. It was so interesting years ago when the Biden campaign accused Facebook of allowing this fake video to spread and asked them to take it down. And they wrote back. Katie Harbath at the time signed this letter back to them. She was one of their directors at Facebook. Political speech is the most scrutinized speech in the world, is what it said in that letter. And that's why we're not going to take this down. You can only scrutinize speech if you and the other people you are talking to are seeing the same speech. So even though Fox and MSNBC are portraying two different versions, everyone going on to Fox is seeing the same thing. Everyone who's going to MSNBC is seeing the same thing. I will give you an example from the current election that we helped sort of expose a little bit. There was an advertising campaign. I mean, I could have predicted this. I'm sure Josh could have predicted this as well, that this campaign would happen. There was an advertising campaign that ads were sent to Jews in Pennsylvania about how Harris hates Israel, and ads were sent to Muslims in Michigan about Harris hates Palestinians. And they were very clearly the same version of ads, but with totally different messages, specifically targeting very specific communities. And that is the difference, or that's one of the many differences. It's those two communities cannot come to the proverbial water cooler and have a conversation about things from the same starting point, because they're not even seeing the same things and they don't even know why. It turns out the investigation showed that this was actually a shadow campaign, that if you investigated 3 organizations away, it was funded by Elon Musk. So not only was it affecting potential voters and who they voted for, but it was also sowing more division by pummeling Jews with Harris hates Israel and pummeling Muslims with Harris hates Palestinians. I'm only scratching the surface here because this is like a huge topic, but that is why it is so different. They are using the human behavioral data that they've gathered about you to then decide whose voices they're amplifying to you, what ads they're targeting to you, and you are not in any way having the same experience as anyone else. And so deliberative democratic debate about topics is a lot harder when you are not starting from at least a similar set of information and facts.
Thank you. And if I'm going to try to get in one really quick question to you, Josh, because I think this is a really good one. And the questioner writes, how do we train the coming generations in a way that they are the ones who are in control of AI and not AI being in control of them? Short question.
Yeah, that's a good one to last in. I mean, I think the answer is this is all evolving so fast, it's hard to get an answer to that question, right? To me, I think the importance, I mean, I'll rest on what I've said before, and thanks from the Network 2020, which put this piece where we wrote about this thing called the liar's dividend at Brookings up in the chat here. I really think we need to be super careful about not overhyping things so that we get to a point where nobody trusts anything anymore. Right? At the end of the day, normative theories of democracy are about either getting to choose between competing visions in elections of what the government should be doing, or they're about having accountability where you can throw people out of office when they've behaved in a way that you don't want them to. Both of those things are dependent on us having an ability to trust information about what politicians are doing, what they say they're doing, what they're planning on doing. The type of stuff that Yael was talking about a minute ago, where you can do these sort of micro-targeted campaigns, where you can target messages exactly to people that are lies, that are not true, or that have elements of true, right? Those are dangerous for those kinds of things. Micro-targeting could also has the possibility to be wonderful because it can, for people who don't pay attention to politics, it can make sure they're getting access to information that is important to them, right? That younger people are hearing about student loans and older people are hearing about pension reform, things that are of interest to them. But in all of these things, they're dependent on being able to have a populace that still trusts the information that they're getting, right? And so what I think, I mean, honestly, I don't think it's the young people who I'm most worried about, because the younger people are in schools and the younger people are getting educated about this. My wife teaches middle school, right? And she works with her students about how do you find trustworthy information online? Like, what does it mean to think about a trustworthy source? They're getting kind of information about these things. I think they'll get the same kind of education about AI in these regards. But I think the long-term danger here is or let me not say long-term danger. Let me end on a more positive note. The goal here, I think, is to adequately balance our education of people so that they are aware of these level 1 problems, that there is false information out there that they could end up inadvertently believing to be true because of fill in the blank. But in this case, generative AI. How does generative AI work? How does it make things happen? Somebody put in the chat here, like, are there things that we know that generative AI motions and videos that people know don't work so that we can leave a signal if I wave my hand like this, it's not generative AI talking. This is a large question of provenance. This is a big thing computer scientists are working on, which is how can we mark things as actually real for people? And I think we'll continue to do that. And it's important, right? I think part of the reason that generative AI didn't run amok in the 2024 year of the elections globally is that journalists were keeping an eye out for it. They were publicizing it. And when you had the Canadian thing a couple of years ago with the guy with 3 hands, everyone got roundly mocked over that. So I think we do want to pay attention to educate people about these level 1 concerns about believing things that aren't true. But I think we have to learn and think carefully about how we find the balance to not get people into a world where they think nothing is real or that nothing can be confirmed as being real. And I think that's the challenge. Those are the tools that we want to be giving to younger people, middle-aged people, and older people, right, across the board as we think about the evolution of the information environment in the AI world.
Yeah, I mean, people don't want to be told they were wrong or they fell for disinformation, but people are open to learning how they perhaps were manipulated. And that's another big differentiator in how to talk about some of these things. At least for me, it is as well.
It's a great note to end on. Thank you both. This has been incredible. I think it's incredibly important. I think it's changing so much that hopefully we can redo this discussion in person in New York sometime, which would be wonderful. Thank you both so much. Thank you to everyone who was listening. I know Brian's been putting in the chat about some of our upcoming events. We do have a discussion tonight that's virtual for members only, and we're looking at Turkey's role in Syria and sort of what to expect from their foreign policy. We also have an in-person event coming up next week for members, and that's with Colonel Wilfred Rivera, and we'll be talking about industrial base policy. So we got a lot of good stuff going on. We are a nonprofit. We encourage people to donate. So if you can, we very much appreciate it. And Josh, Yael, you've both been terrific. Thank you so much for the work you're doing and for taking the time to talk to us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Bye-bye.